Have you ever felt like you want to be close to someone more than anything, and yet at the same time you feel panicky and overwhelmed of getting close? Like part of you craves intimacy while another part is scanning for the first sign of betrayal, rejection, or abandonment already. This is because especially early trauma shapes the way we attach, connect, and even perceive safety and danger in others. And therefore, in today's episode, we are going to break this down together. What is the core symptom behind interpersonal instability or unstable relationships? How does trauma fundamentally rewire the way we attach to others? And how can we start to manage those overwhelming emotional reactions in relationships without losing ourselves? Ready to go? Let's dive in. Welcome to today's episode. My name is Robert, and this video is based on my own experience, research, and therapy work. I'm not a healthcare professional myself. Instead, I share a client's perspective here on this channel. And for everyone who's looking for more in-depth resources for working through the symptoms of complex childhood trauma, I share the most significant learnings and practical exercises from years of therapy in our online courses and premium community, and you can get access at understandable.net/join. And a quick overview, this video today is the fifth one of an 8-part series on the major core symptoms of childhood trauma. And in this series, we are discussing those 8 symptoms described in my favorite CPTSD paper, Adult Survivors of Childhood Trauma, which are hypervigilance, flashbacks, altered attention, emotional dysregulation, today, interpersonal instability or unstable relationships, and we have toxic shame, somatic symptoms, and avoidance. You find all the links to all the episodes of this series in the description below every episode and in our channel playlist about complex childhood trauma. So what is interpersonal instability? In the paper Adult Survivors of Childhood Trauma, this term interpersonal instability is mentioned a lot, and while it's a clinical and actually really precise term, to me and maybe also to you, it is a bit blurry what it actually describes. So let's break that down. So first of all, interpersonal instability refers to difficulties in maintaining stable, healthy relationships. This is why I, for example, put on the thumbnail here, unstable relationships. And that's basically the symptom of complex trauma. Now, it often stems from a disordered attachment and poor relationship modeling during childhood. So basically childhood trauma, which causes insecure attachment styles, as we talked about in the last weeks here on this channel quite a lot. Now, trauma that involves a betrayal of trust, for example, abuse by family, by teachers, by religious leaders, that worsens interpersonal struggles. And therefore, survivors of childhood trauma may lose their ability to detect unsafe behaviors in others, making them more vulnerable to unsafe or toxic relationships later in life. And an interesting indicator of this core trauma symptom is that these issues often become especially pronounced during major life events like marriage, pregnancy, or childbirth. So this is where you often get triggered, where you feel overwhelmed, where you feel it's too much, okay? Because those problems come up more as you have to commit more to a relationship. Now, how does trauma shape our attachment? Also a big question in that context. Interpersonal instability is created through a wounding of our attachment style. And when we talk about attachment, we are talking about how safe or how unsafe we feel when we try to connect with others. And that wiring starts very, very early, quite often in the first few years of our lives, or sometimes even before birth. If you grew up in an environment where your emotions were met with consistency, with warmth and safety, then your system likely developed what we call a secure attachment. So you learned it's safe to trust, it's safe to love, and I have a lot of resources to re-regulate myself. You are what clinicians say interpersonally stable. But when you grew up with trauma, with neglect, emotional inconsistency, with criticism or even abandonment, then your nervous system learned something else. It learned that love is unpredictable, that trust gets you hurt, or that connection isn't safe. And depending on how your nervous system adapted, you might develop patterns like an avoidant attachment style, like pulling away from closeness to protect yourself, an anxious attachment style, being clinging, being needy, clinging tightly and fearing abandonment, or a disorganized attachment style, swinging between wanting closeness and fearing it. And as I said, we talked a lot about that in the previous weeks here on this channel, and I made an 8-part series about all the attachment styles as well, and I will link to you episode 1 of that series above here, so you can check out the whole series. Now, what's important to understand for you in this is that trauma wires you for protection over connection. And here's what happens on a deeper level if that's the case for us. When early relationships feel unsafe or unpredictable, then our nervous systems literally prioritize survival over intimacy. Now, we saw that in our video about the polyvagal theory, for example, which I will link to up here in the description below. And this isn't a conscious choice if you live in that state. It's an automatic, deeply biological response, a protection mechanism within your body-mind system. Now, research shows that chronic early stress, especially emotional neglect and abuse, cause the brain's threat detection system, the so-called amygdala in the brain, to become hyperactive. At the same time, the areas responsible for trust, for emotional regulation and social bonding, like the prefrontal cortex and the oxytocin systems, oxytocin, the cuddling hormone, those become underdeveloped and dysregulated. And we can see that, for example, in this video, where I discussed the dysregulation of different brain areas in CPTSD compared with ADHD. We'll link to you that up here and of course in the description below. So in short, that means that your brain becomes wired to detect danger quickly even when no real danger is present. And therefore trust feels unsafe because your system expects abandonment, betrayal or rejection. Intimacy triggers those survival instincts and not relaxation and comfort, and therefore protection becomes the default setting in your life. Connection becomes the risk setting in your life, and that even persists as an adult. So when you're a grown-up, then in a relationship, you can start to feel close, and your body might respond with anxiety, with withdrawal, anger, or fear before you even understand why. And it's not that you don't want love or connection or closeness, because often we want, as I said in the intro, is that your nervous system still believes that love equals danger. Now, how can we differentiate between genuine relationship issues and trauma-induced perceptions? And that is another thing that I personally often struggle with, the disruption of my perception in terms of trust in my gut feeling or in my intuition. Because this is often what happens to us if we experience trauma early on, right? Everybody says to you, you have to trust in your gut feeling, trust your intuition, but I believe that our trust and our gut feeling, our intuition, is disrupted if we have those difficult experiences from the past. And therefore, one of the hardest parts of healing from CPTSD is this, to learn to trust your own perceptions again. Usually, when you have a secure attachment style, your gut feeling is meant to help you sense when something feels right or wrong. And that works pretty accurate. Let me tell you that this system is really a system we can trust and where we should have this basic trust feeling within our bodies. But here comes the point. If you have CPTSD, that internal radar often gets scrambled. Sometimes your gut then even screams danger when you're actually safe. And you have this weird gut feeling and your intuition telling you there's something wrong, but is actually not the case. So sometimes your gut gets numb when everything is all right, when everything is fine, and sometimes your gut is right, but how can you distinguish between those two different states? And one thing I'd like to add here is that it's actually literally your gut telling you that on a somatic level, which we'll see in episode 7 as well of this series in a couple weeks. Now, these gut sensations make it incredibly hard to know, is this fear valid or is it just my trauma being reactivated? And this is why we often find ourselves second guessing, or we believe things that our intuition is basically telling us, but it's actually from our trauma body. For example, as Peter Levine calls it. I'd like to give you an example. I always sensed that the relationships I were in were bad for me. But was it actually the truth? Now, looking back, I'm 100% sure that it was not the case, and that my avoidant attachment patterns made me escape those relationships. Because not my partners or my relationships were harmful for me, but because my nervous system was active in order to protect me. Typical avoidant attachment style response. And this is why we also do a full episode about avoidance in 2 weeks here on this channel. How do I tell the difference now in our daily life when we are maybe unconscious, when we just get the information from the gut feeling? There are 3 possible steps that you can go here. Number 1 is to check the pattern and not just the moment. That means to ask yourself, is this an isolated moment or part of a repeated pattern here? For example, has this person generally been trustworthy, or are there consistent red flags? This way you can identify that. Trauma reactions often magnify single moments, and therefore healing invites you to look at the bigger picture. Number 2 is to check the proportion of the reaction. You can ask yourself here, is my emotional reaction much bigger than the situation seems to call for? Does this feeling remind me of an old wound, even if the current situation isn't the same? And often we forget old memories, as we saw, for example, in this episode about fragmented memories though. And you can work, for example, using hypnotherapy or another depth psychological approach to work through that and to find out old buried memories that you forgot about. If your reaction feels overwhelming, then chances are high that a past pain is coloring the present moment here. And number 3, regulate first, then reflect. So when you're triggered, it's almost impossible to think clearly. So the goal isn't to immediately figure it all out. No, the goal is to calm your body down first through grounding or breathing or pausing techniques, and then come back to the situation with a clear and calmer mind. Only from a regulated state, you can begin to ask, is this about what's happening now, or is my past fear stepping into the present here? And if you want to learn how to re-regulate more efficiently, I would like to remind you that we have a free full workbook called Re-Regulation Resources, which is everything you basically need to re-regulate your nervous system and connect with your sense of self again. You can get it for free at understandable.net/book. And now the final big question. How can you manage intense emotional reactions in relationships more efficiently? Now, relationships can be very triggering for many of us, especially if we survived childhood trauma. And it would be very nice, I think you agree on that, if we could remove those triggers forever from our lives, right? But the truth is, managing emotional reactions in relationships isn't about never getting triggered anymore. No, it's about building the skills to notice when it happens, when you get triggered, and when there is the need to regulate your nervous system. And choose how you want to respond to that triggering situation. For every attachment style that your early trauma might have created, healing looks a bit different. And therefore, I want to raise your attention here to those videos that we created in the past weeks. Healing an avoidant attachment style an anxious attachment style, a disorganized attachment style, and how to become a securely attached person. I will put all those 4 links of these episodes in the description below today's episode. And if you're looking for a more guided solution here on how to break free and work through complex childhood trauma, I also want to remind you that we have a premium community where I share everything that I learned while working with 4 different therapists on trauma and attachment wounds myself. And I put that into more than 30 video courses. And I also include all the practical exercises that I got from years of therapy. So guided step-by-step path here that you might also follow along as well. Maybe in a bit different order, but definitely something very practical here. You can join the platform and the courses at understandable.net/join and get access today. Link in the description as well. And now I'm curious what you think. How do you manage unstable relationships? Where are you on your healing journey through becoming a more securely attached person? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to support the podcast, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Subscribe to the channel. And I see and speak to you next time here on the channel for another episode. Have a great day.